Today, I'd like to talk about slavery in the Bible. Now, there are some obvious analogies in terms of spiritual slavery, which we'll try to actually stay away from, and talk more about the physical aspect of slavery and why it was so prevalent in the Bible, and why uh, you know actually God's people participated in it. I think more specifically, I think is where a lot of times the conundrum comes from, and that God actually even gave specific instructions of how to deal with slaves. So it's obviously a part of the biblical history, but just as kind of a background, slavery has been a part of this world basically since the beginning. Whether we go all the way back to Babylon, or you start looking at the Greek Empire and the servitude that they placed people under, or perhaps the Romans, who probably even were more cruel and arduous and harsh in their treatment of the people that they had subdued. It has been worldwide, even among religions. I think, you look at, say, Catholicism, and it says, okay, yeah, we are against slavery, but yet nonetheless they were participating in it to a certain degree, because whenever you start, one of the ways that slaves were actually transferred was through property. So it kind of came with the property, and the Catholics gained property, and yet they had these slaves working on them that they did nothing about. It was kind of like turn a blind eye to it. Islam, accepted slavery as well throughout the world, and it wasn't, I think, until about 1962 that they actually said, okay, we need to ban slavery, which is, by all accounts, very, very late. I think as of today, all countries have banned slavery, yet slavery still exists, probably 20 to 30 million by some accounts. There's no country or continent or religion, I don't think, that was actually immune to it in that sense. Whether it was Western Europe or Asia. Of course, we know about Africa, and we know about our own history here around the 15th and 16th centuries. I think it maybe even exploded to a large degree when the Portuguese navigators used to go up and down the African coast buying slaves, particularly African slaves, and it was a very profitable trade for probably 500 years, of which, of course, the British took part in, as well as the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and so on. In fact, the Portuguese were such an integral part of this slave trade that their country became, the ethnic background of it actually shifted because there were so many slaves that they had brought into the country, as opposed to, just the indigenous people, or the Portuguese, as it were. And then, of course, we know about, the slave trade here, but I mean, preceding the African slave trade in America were the American Indians, that they tried, again, to make into servants, and they tended to rebel and run away and resist. And so the ones who came here ended up using a lot more African slaves. So that's been the history of mankind. Of course, we look at, we're more familiar with the history here in the U.S., and you look at it and you go, okay, well, it's been gone for 135 years or so now, and yet the effects of it still exist. So, the Bible talks about to the third and fourth generation, some of these, sins, these problems visit, the daughters and the sons of the ones who it was perpetrated upon. But yet, here we are, maybe 5, 6 generations or more, depending on, how the generations worked out. But at the basis of it in the U.S., interestingly enough, was economics for slavery, for the trade. They needed people to work the farms, and they wanted them to do it for a cheap price, and they worked hard. And, if you look at the North weren't necessarily the holier than thou. They just didn't want the South necessarily to have this economic advantage that they had to compete against. It's very similar today, when we try to compete against the Chinese in terms of pricing, yet their labor, sometimes maybe $1 a day or whatever it is now, is hard to compete when you have to pay somebody nearly $100 a day as a minimum wage. So all of a sudden you start seeing how the North could be a little bit upset with people in contiguous states were actually being able to have quote unquote cheap labor. It's interesting enough too that whenever you look up the definition of slavery, it says someone who's legally owned by another person is forced to work for that person without pay. So you're starting to see there was an economic aspect to it. Uh, that being said, it seems like the Israelitish nations have been a little bit kinder towards slaves than other people in the world have. And we can keep that in mind as we go through, and maybe we'll see some of the reasons why that actually happened. But nonetheless, it did happen because it was profitable. It was worldwide. And in fact, this whole idea of abolition of slavery didn't even happen until the British, the ones that we're talking about here, the Israelitish nations, actually said, okay, we need to stop doing this. And there was, I think, a council of about 12 very religious, devout men who said, okay, we need to stop this slave trade. And they did it based on godly principles. And so they were the first, in spite of the fact that they were making a lot of money for it and that the rest of the world was doing it. So eventually, and that was probably about around the late 1800s, around the time that they were doing it here, this whole emancipation proclamation that Lincoln had put through. Obviously, it's still going on today. And whenever we think of slavery, I think in our mind, we have this harsh, brutal type of slavery in mind. We think of people who, when we look at the biblical times, people like the Egyptians who made the Israelites work real hard, making them make the bricks and then make it without the straw. And then perhaps the Assyrians who took the Israelites into captivity, and the Assyrians are known specifically for their cruelness throughout the history of their, existence. Now, I think we start to realize why people become slaves. But let's go through a list of reasons, because they're not all exactly what we think, but there is a primary cause for slavery. But people have been made slaves because of restitution, right? They have to pay back something that they owe for some reason, whether it's a fine or damage that they caused to themselves. They had to go and they had to work it off. And they could, in a sense, work it off by selling themselves as a slave or being sold as a slave until they served their time paying off the debt that they owe. If you defaulted on a debt, you could become a slave in the same way. So if you went bankrupt, you may be forced to sell either yourself or even your wife or children. They could be not just sold, but they could be even confiscated by the creditor for this debt until it was worked off. Of course, one of the first things that I learned about as a kid, this kind of voluntary slavery, or we called it indentured servants, I think it was indentured servitude, was the way that some of the settlers who came to the U.S. chose to pay off their debt. So they couldn't afford to come to this new land in America. So they said, okay, look, I'll give you 7 years of my life when I get there, and then we can go ahead and I can then have my debt paid off, and I can go ahead and go on with my life. But the primary cause of slavery is war. So in the course of history, when mankind has fought one another, the victor has, more often than not, taken the enemy as slaves. So they've subdued them, they've taken them, and they've captured them, and they placed them into the slavery that I think we all think of. This one where it was fostered by hate to begin with, and you go and say, okay, these people now are going to really pay for what they've done and for what has happened and for whatever the causes of the war were in their mind. And that one is the one I think that we think of most often, and that one is obviously the most brutal, and it's one of just complete hatred. But some of those people then are sold. They can be sold to other countries. That's another way of becoming a slave, is through the selling. Whether you are, taken in war, or whether you're abducted. Again, maybe it doesn't have to necessarily be a war. It can be just, you go into, like they did in Africa. Some of the tribes just go in and just grab people and bring them out. In fact, the African tribes were some of the biggest perpetrators of slavery, selling their own quote unquote people in the country to other people, whether it was to white men or to other black men. And of course, another way was to be born into slavery. So some of these, children of slaves were automatically slaves, even though none of the prior things had happened. So there were a multitude of ways to become a slave. Now, as you can imagine, this is not something that God would want. But nonetheless, it happens, and he allows it because he can still accomplish his purpose. But let's look at 1 Samuel 8 and verse 7 as we get to the root of these reasons for slavery. 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 7. And we'll read down to verse 20. First Samuel 8 and verse 7. This is a good memorization scripture because, as you'll see, it's not only appropriate for what we're talking about today, but it's appropriate for many of the other problems that we have. And the Lord said to Samuel, who is the prophet of the time who God spoke to and who instructed the people of Israel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, from what he was telling them to do from God. God was telling Samuel, telling the people, and Samuel's, of course, feeling dejected here. He says, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. They said, in effect, whenever they said they wanted a king to rule over them instead of God, they were rejecting God. And this is where we come to, the heart of the matter, as I was mentioning before, for a lot of the problem is that when mankind rejects God, that's when the problems happen. So he goes on in verse 8, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, so out of their slavery, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. So he's saying that, again, I know they're doing this to you, but really, in effect, they're doing it to me. So I'm telling you what I'm going to do. Go ahead, therefore, and heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will rule over them. So without getting too far ahead of the story, it was Saul that they chose. They got to choose the man that they wanted to rule over them instead of God. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. He said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. Okay, you had God, but now this is what you want, and this is what you're going to get. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariot. So even at the very beginning of this, of leaving God and going towards a king who is supposed to be, somewhat benevolent, who wants to rule the country, who wants to make it grow, who wants to be loved, who wants to be powerful and strong and all the other things, what he's going to do is he's going to begin with the enslavement of your sons and appoint them in these other offices of necessary for war. He will appoint captains over his thousands, captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow the ground, reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war. So he's going to get them doing all sorts of things, and his equipment for his chariots. So this is what he's going to do. And if we think back to the example of Jericho, God had his way of, subduing a people. But this king's going to come in, and there's going to be problems with that, as we'll get into a little bit later. Not only is he going to take your sons, he's going to take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. Again, another type of slavery, as it were. These people may have been free to go home, but they weren't free not to do what the king wanted either. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. I mean, that almost sounds like war to me. Whenever somebody comes in and takes over whatever it is that you have and takes it for themselves. Is that not what happens again in war? He will take a tenth of your grain, your vintage, give it to his officers and his servants, and he'll take your male servants and your female servants, your finest young men, your donkeys, and put them to work. He'll take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. So there he says it right there. You will now serve this man who will rule over you. And you will cry out in that day because your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, in spite of all of this, he told them what was going to happen. I can only assume that either they didn't believe him or their desire to have a king like all the surrounding nations was just that great that they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to refuse to obey the Lord, the voice of Samuel, and we want a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. God said he was going to fight the battles for them. But here, they want to be like the people around them, the nations around them. They want to have a king. And they want that king to do this. And so they said they're willing to put up with this type of slavery. And the point here, then, to reiterate, is that they chose to reject God. And through a rejection of God, the people became slaves. John 8 and verse 34. We come to the core of where slavery comes from, the reason for slavery. John 8 and verse 34. It says, most assuredly, I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. So we see that sin produces slavery. Slavery is the result of sin. And this is the core, the main reason for slavery. So even when we go back to all the other reasons that we had mentioned before of why people or how they become slaves, at the base and the core of all those is sin. A slave is a person whose ability to make choices in life has either been given away or taken away. So a slave is a person whose ability to make choices in life has either been given away or taken away. So whether they give it away or it's taken away, they become a slave through sin. So for example, the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath. If in the past or in other times of slavery by Gentile nations, people tried to keep the Sabbath, they were not allowed to do that because the Gentile nations had no desire to do that. I mean, they were, in addition to being harsh and brutal, they were ungodly. They didn't even know the law of God. No, they were not going to let their money, as it were, not work for them on the Sabbath. And it's going to be this way in the future as well. Whenever the nations that we know of that are foretold to take into captivity, the nations of Israel and who they encompass, as well as Judah, do you think that they're going to allow these things? They're not going to allow you to make the choices that you need to make or should be making, because you will be a slave, and your ability to make the choices that you should be making will have been taken away from you. This is why slavery is wrong, because it does not allow you to do the godly things that you should be doing, that you need to be doing. So slavery was not a device of God. It was not something that he ever wanted. Also, I don't think that God, for the most part, and in many cases, wanted Israel to commingle with the people around them. So if they were to go into war, they did not want to take them back into the camps, much like, as you can imagine, what has happened to Portugal. If the Portuguese, took so many people that became the predominant people in the country, pretty soon the country starts losing all the things that it is, whether that's its culture or its godly beliefs. They're replacing it with another nation that then comes in and does things that you don't want them to do. So he wanted Israel to come out of the world. He did not want to bring the world into Israel either. He didn't want to bring it into them or among them. He knew that the problems that it would bring. And as we look through the Old Testament, there are many warnings that God gives to the Israelites in terms of about going after false gods that would be brought in by these people, or marrying into the women of the culture and the problems that would bring. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 2 and verse 30 and see how God approached this in a sense. In Deuteronomy 2 and verse 30 through 37, we'll go through a couple examples right here, just to kind of reiterate the point. But as the nation of Israel had just come out of captivity and slavery, and they were now traveling across the wilderness and into the land of Canaan, there were peoples that they ran into and problems that they had. But in verse 30 of Deuteronomy 2, but Sihon, king of Heshbon, would not let us pass through, for the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might deliver him into your hand, as it is this day. And the Lord said to me, see, I have begun to give Sihon and his hand over to you. Begin to possess it, that you may inherit this land. So God had a purpose for them to inherit the land. He was giving it to them. And notice what happens to the people of the land. And so God had his people moving into the land. And what did he do with the people of the land? Then Sihon and all his people came out against us to fight at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him over to us, so we defeated him, his sons and all his people. We took all his cities at that time. And notice this, we utterly destroyed the men, women, and little ones of every city. We left none remaining. There was no one to take into slavery. There were no prisoners. Of course, a lot of times we look at this and we say, okay, well, that sounds like a harsh God. But again, without getting too far off the subject, God is a God of mercy, God of understanding. He's a God that knows. He's a God that is working out things. And plus, he is able to bring everybody back to life as he sees fit, either in that time or, more probably, in the future. Whenever then they will have their chance at salvation. But it was just a physical death that God has complete control over. It says we took only the livestock as plunder for ourselves, with the spoil of the cities which we took. From Aurora, which is on the bank of the river Ammon, from the city that is the ravine, as far as Gilead, there was not one city too strong for us. The Lord our God delivered all to us. Only you do not go into the land of the people of Ammon anywhere along the river Jabbok or the cities of the mountains, wherever the Lord our God had forbidden us. So he gave them some boundaries. He told them what to do. He told them where to go and how to handle the inhabitants of the land. So what we're seeing here is that all the people were destroyed. So without getting also into it further, who were these people outside the, what we know of the king? God destroyed them all. There were no slaves. There was nobody to bring into the camp. Joshua 6, verses 20 and 21, what I was referring to a little bit earlier, in terms of Jericho, what happened at Jericho. And this is what I always like to look back to whenever, God says in terms of a physical way of, he will fight your fights. We all know the story of Jericho. We pick it up in verse 20. It says, so the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet. And the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. And then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man, woman, young, and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. Okay, so in this case, he said, even the livestock, I don't want you to take. I don't want you to leave anyone alive with the exception of one, right? Rahab and her relatives. That was it. So God took her, and he had a purpose for Rahab. And as you know, she was in the direct lineage of Jesus Christ. God, in his infinite wisdom, brought her and her relatives into the camp of Israel because he had a purpose for her. And among other things, that was to be actually in the lineage. So God brought this one Gentile and her family into and among the people of God. Joshua 8:26, I'll read it to you. For Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the spear until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. And if you remember the story, they had some problems because of the sin of Achan. But then after that was all settled, he goes in. And there are other stories, along this path where they did this and it was correct. That's what God did. And there was stories where they didn't do what they were supposed to do like this. And, God became angry because of the fact that they didn't do it. So the point here then is that, we have to consider the fact that God did not want slavery to a large degree and to a certain degree because he didn't want his people being, commingled with other sinful people who brought in their culture and their ways and, would then take the people of Israel away from God. But of course, that being said, it did eventually happen, whether, God allowed it, like in the case of Rahab, or because the Israelites went away from what God had wanted them to do. Because of this, God made provisions before the incidents that we read anyway, where they actually killed everyone, for the treatment of slaves. And the interesting thing about this is that it was, in a way, a foreshadow of things to come. Let's look at a little bit of how they were treated, and maybe I'll just refer to it. But for instance, in some of the instructions that God gave to them, he said, if the punishment of a slave was excessive, then the slave got to go free. So if the owner treated them too excessively or too abusively, like the Gentile nations did, and like everybody that we think of when we think of the term slave did, then they got to go free. Or if they fled a cruel master, God would say, okay, that's it. They don't have to be returned to that kind of person. So what we find in the instructions and in the Bible and the treatment of slaves is that it parallels what you're supposed to be doing as a Christian. It falls in line with how we are to treat our neighbors. So it's the golden rule in many respects, that you're to treat others the way that you would like to be treated in that godly way. So Job 31, verses 13 through 15. Job kind of echoes this sentiment. Job 31, verses 13 through 15. Of course, as we think about this, we're going, well, of course, that's what God wants and expects of us. He has always expected, even in the Old Testament times of his people, as well as the New Testament times. We see a lot of what Christ quoted and others is taken directly from the Old Testament. Job 31 verse 13 says, "If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me." So when they complained against me, did I take heed to what they were saying? Did I honor it as a Christian should? "What then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb?" Job is saying here that, again, the servants or the slaves deserve to be treated, and that is what God expects of us, as well as the godly slave owner, servant owner, is to treat them according to the golden rule, or according to the Ten Commandments, according to all the laws of God. And this is at the basis of the instructions that he gave to the Israelites in terms of how they were to treat those that did become enslaved and servants. In Colossians 4:1, I'll read it for you. It says, "Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." So again, treat them the way that you would want your master in heaven to treat you. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, is that we find that even more meaningful relationships develop because of the way that the slaves or the servants were treated. So they were expected to be treated like a Christian. So this is the relationship that was supposed to be there in that respect, as a Christian should treat their neighbor in the world, down the street, that you come across on a day-to-day basis. So if you start treating them that way, if you start letting your light shine, what then develops in terms of this relationship, this master-servant, master-slave type relationship? 1 Chronicles 2, verse 34 and 35. We find that a transformation begins to take place among those people that are under you, that are under the slave owner, servant owner. And now Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. And Sheshan had an Egyptian servant, a Gentile servant, not a part of the body of, or the people of God, I should say, whose name was Jarha. Sheshan gave his daughter to Jarha, his servant, as wife, and she bore him a tie. So what we're seeing here then is that this servant who was under Sheshan had gained a certain amount of respect, had become a certain person, and even as I think it was Gill, one of the commentaries, says, he was a proselyte. So basically, he was a Gentile convert. I'm not sure where Gill gets that information, or if he pulls it from the information here, but he becomes a convert, which I don't think is too far of a stretch whenever you start looking at what we're going to look at here in just a second. But the point is that we see another step in this development of the relationship that they have between the slave and the master. It went so far as to say, okay, I'm going to give you my wife. You are a son, you would be a son-in-law that I would like to have. Because of why? Because, was it because of the way he treated him? Yeah, it was. But how did he treat him? And we see that up in verse 3 that this is the lineage of the sons of Judah that we're going through. Of course, Christ was of that same lineage of Judah. So we see that now this slave is becoming an inheritor. He is gaining the same inheritance. He's becoming a part of the people of God. at that time, the physical nation of Israel, as it were. And he goes on, Attai begot Nathan, who begot Zabad, who begot Ephlal, who begot Obed. So we're seeing that because of him having been brought in as a servant, he is kind of moving on and moving beyond even that initial relationship because of the laws that God gave governing how you treat a slave and a servant. Now, Exodus 20 and verse 10, I can just cite it for you because I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. But we find that the relationship that the slave is to have or a servant is to have doesn't even stop there. God expected the slave and the servant not to work on the Sabbath. In other words, he expected the servant and the slave to keep the Sabbath. He says, on the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, your daughter, your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. They were all to be keeping the Sabbath. They weren't to be doing work in that respect, in that way. But it could actually even go beyond that. And I'll get you to turn with me to Exodus 12 and verse 43. Keeping in mind that these people started out as a servant or a slave. Now we have to have this kind of paradigm shift from what we believe a servant or a slave is and how they are to how God expects us to treat them for the reasons that he sees, that he has. Exodus 12 and verse 43. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it. That would include servants and slaves. They were foreigners. But every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. And to me, that implies the servant giving over. I don't know that these men would actually go through circumcision voluntarily for no reason, unless there was this intent to be a part of the people of God and to celebrate the Passover, which has come to be one of the most solemn days of the year for us. So it goes on, a sojourner and a hired servant, they shall not eat of it. They can't take the Passover. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And this is in the giving of the instructions of the Passover in Exodus 12. All the congregation of Israel, all the people of God at the time, his people that he was working with, shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells within you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as one of the native of the land. He shall be as a native of the land. Not like a foreigner, not like a stranger, not like a servant, not like a slave. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So two separate laws, as it were. So why would this happen? Why would somebody go from our idea of a slave or servant all the way through and say, okay, keeping the Sabbath, becoming a son-in-law, marrying into this lineage, becoming an inheritor of the inheritance? Is it because they were beat all the time unjustly? Was it because they had a harsh taskmaster? Is that what led these people to wanting to celebrate this festival of God with the nation of Israel? Or was it because the Hebrews or the Israelites treated their servants and slaves in the way that a Christian should, as defined by God? Was it because these people saw their light? They saw a better way. They saw God among these people. So because they acted in a Christian way, we find Deuteronomy 15 verse 15 through 17, we find it even goes beyond a step where I say most of us would imagine. And of course, you understand when I say when they acted in a Christian way, they acted in a godly way. They followed the laws of God. They followed and did what God said, even though they were a people who had an uncircumcised heart. And this is what God gets to in the New Testament, that we're supposed to have a circumcised heart. So this was again a symbol of what was to come. But in Deuteronomy 15 and verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. I mean, that should be fresh on their minds, that they were ruled by these harsh taskmasters, and that they should not in turn be that way either. Because, first off, God said, don't be that way. It's not the way to be. And, they should have a better example and understand perfectly why. You shouldn't treat somebody that way. And the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. Talking about, slaves. And if it happens that he says to you, your slave or your servant, I will not go away from you, because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you, then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also, to your female servant you shall do likewise. So can we imagine then a slave, as it were, or a servant, getting to the point where he says, I love you. I don't want another way. I want to be a part of your family, of the people of God. Does that in any way marry up with our idea of slavery, of servitude, as we have come to know it and understand it, as we've seen the example among all other peoples in the world? Of course not. We see this coming into the people of God by this example, by the treatment, by the nurturing and fostering of this relationship, that it goes from a foreigner to being a person of God, being a part of the people of God, I should say. Let's look at Leviticus 25 and verse 38. Leviticus 25 verse 38. I'll read down to 46. We'll notice a few of the rules and what God intended in terms of the treatment of slaves. Now understand too that some of the Israelites could actually sell themselves as slaves, and we talked about that before in terms of you can sell yourself to pay off a debt, and then you could also be redeemed, or you could just work for a certain amount of time. Typically it was 6 years for them to sell themselves. It says in verse 38 of Leviticus 25, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor, one of your brethren, and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner he shall be with you, and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, or the year of release. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and he shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. God called the Israelites his servants. They were to be serving him. They were not to be serving another man, as was the case of the foreigner. And that is the way the foreigner began. in this relationship, they began serving in this, as we go through, the Israelite. And as we saw before in Exodus 12:49, there shall be one law for the native born and one for the stranger who dwells among you. So continuing in verse 43, in talking about the Israelites that were sold themselves into slavery, you shall not rule over him with rigor or cruelty, but you shall fear your God, because they are not yours. They're not your servants. They're not your slaves in that sense. They are God's. And this is just a deal to help them, a means that God put into place to help them get back on their feet. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you. Now we're getting back to what we were talking about before, these people coming in. From them you may buy male and female slaves from the nations around you. Moreover, you may buy the children of strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property, or I think it's money, as it says in some of the verses. And you may take them as inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. You shall not treat them in the way that you were treated, or that I don't expect you to treat them. You shall live according to godly laws. And then in the last two verses, verse 54 and 55, and if he is not redeemed in these years, talking about your brother, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. He paid for them. They are his. That's who he wants. You do not take them to yourselves in that same way. So we see this principle, in Galatians 6:10 to a certain degree. It says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all. So you're supposed to do good to everyone, especially to those who are the household of faith. God is again telling them the same. But as we look at this and we think about this in terms of what we now understand in terms of the progression of a relationship, what then does that lead us to believe in terms of this one law for the native born and the one for the stranger? God obviously expects more of us, more of those that he is working with, like right now, today. This is our day of judgment. We have been given a certain amount of knowledge and understanding that God expects us to act on, whereas he does not expect that of the rest of the world at this point, except for those that he is calling. But as we've seen, the stranger or the slave or the foreigner can become a part of Israel. They can become a part of the people of God. Does that sound familiar? Recently, I gave a sermon on Gentiles. And let's go to a scripture that we covered in that message in Galatians 3, verses 27 through 29. In Galatians 3, verses 27 through 29. And now we're going to look at it in this context of what we're talking about today. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. There is neither slave nor free. Okay, do we get that? There is neither slave nor free if you put on Christ. And what does that mean if you put on Christ? If you come into the fold, if you become a people of the God, then you're neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So what was the point of the message on Gentiles? Is that there will be no Gentiles in the family of God. All right? Does that mean that it's only people with, blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this physical blood? No. He says, if you're part of Christ, then you're part of Abraham's seed, and you're part of the heirs of that promise. You can be an inheritor of those things once you put on Christ. All have become a part of this once you put on Christ. We become spiritual Israelites, even those with Gentile blood. Before that, they, us, all were slaves. Now we were slaves to sin in that respect before we were freed through this liberality which is Christ. So whenever we start looking at that, then looking at the symbolism and the foreshadowing and how everything works together, what we have seen is then that through this slavery, that people can be emancipated from it and become people of God by following God's ways. So do we now see how the treatment of these people within the congregation of Israel brought even the Gentiles into and among the people of God? I mean, surely that's not what we thought or think in terms of, slavery. That is not the purpose of man's slavery and is, the servile, nature of their captivity of people when they take them. It's not to give them a greater purpose and more of a promise and more blessing. It's the exact opposite. Colossians 3, verses 9 through 13. Colossians 3, verses 9 through 13. As we kind of move into the New Testament and see the more spiritual view of these things and move away a little bit from the physical, nonetheless we can make the associations. It says, do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, talking about the way that you used to act. Okay, you acted like all the nations around the world. You acted like the Gentiles. But you've put that on, and you've put on the new man who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, nor free. But Christ is all and end all. So he's saying, whenever you can put that off and start heading this other direction, then you become godly. You don't become anything else. And it doesn't matter what you were or are even. Therefore, as the elect of God now, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies. I'm telling you how you're to continue acting. And again, we make the parallel with how the Israelites, in their limited ability, were to act. I say limited ability because they did not have the Spirit of God working in them as we do. Put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. The Israelites, even though they were people of God, were not the ones to throw a stone. They were to be the first to throw a stone. They all had their sins and their shortcomings. And they needed to realize, having been through everything that they had been through, realizing who and what they really were, not that they could fully do that, that they were to treat one another in a godly manner. 1 Corinthians 12:12 through 14. We need to be a little more broad-minded when we start thinking of the people of God and who they are and who they can be and could be. 1 Corinthians 12:12, it says, for as the body is one and has many members, but all the members are of that one body. Being many, are one body, so also is Christ. This is what God is working towards. He would have that all men should be saved. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jew or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. For in fact, the body is not one member, but many. So who is it that God is calling today? We don't know. We've been told how we're to treat people, but the person that you might be, doing something to or saying something to, no matter what walk of life they come from, could be somebody that is going to be a part of this body, whether they're a slave or free. One final set of scriptures in Ephesians 6, verse 5 through 9. Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. Bond servants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ. So he's saying that servants need to be that way towards their masters. And of course we read that masters need to be a certain way towards bond servants. So whatever position you find yourself in, wherever you are, there's supposed to be this mutual godliness between you two. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ. We are the servants ultimately of Christ. And this is what God was saying in effect to the Israelites, saying, you are my servants. And as we saw, some of the Gentiles could come in and be a part of the people of God. And we're not going to go through how they did that, but they were able to do that, just as they are today, even more readily to come in and to be a part of the body of Christ, to have that one Spirit, no matter where they came from what walk of life, from whatever their skin color is, to whatever their status or state of life is, whether free or slave. We are ultimately, these bondservants to Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Again, that's what we reiterated. What is the will of God? Being godly. That's what we're to be doing. With good will, doing service as to the Lord, not to men. When we do these things, we're doing it as we are doing it to God, not just to the men that's being done to. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, and no matter what state he is, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. So these were not the most important things to God, whether you were a slave or a master, but how you acted in those respective parts that you were to play. And you, masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master, God, also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. He doesn't see the black and white and the slave and free, the Jew and the Greek. He sees you without partiality. Slavery becomes because of sin. Whether it's of war or not following God, or even not following his principles of money and how to deal with money. But God, knowing that man would fall short, put into place a system that would help not just Israel, but all of mankind get back to where he wants them to be as free men.